I think it's, first of all, big thanks to Tim for inviting me. I am, as he said, the relatively new Chief Executive of the Food and Drink Federation. And I have to say that my relative newness is going to be used here as an excuse for my relative lack of knowledge of some of the really detailed issues that we may need to cover in this session up to 12:30. I come from a background, though, in a related industry, and one which, in the context of this debate, may be as important, as a mechanism for moving this issue in the direction that I suspect a number of us think it should be. What do I mean by that? Well, looking at the figures that came out of the poll just now, the vast majority of this audience wants the UK to stay in the EU. What's interesting is that a much smaller group think that the public will vote to stay in the EU, and an even smaller group think that food and drink policy will be a key driver of that decision. And as we've already begun to hear from Alan and Peter, that is a rather strange thought, because food policy is at the heart of the reason for the UK's membership of the EU. In fact, the reason for the creation of the common market in the 1950s was partly about iron and steel and partly about agriculture. And the UK's membership of, first of all, the common market, then the European Community, then the European Union, has been intimately tied up with the issue of agriculture and food policy for 50 years. So it is very, very strange that the food policy dog doesn't appear to be ready to bark in this particular kennel. And I believe that it is the responsibility of all of us who are associated with food and drink policy, whether we be academics, whether we be from any particular sector of the industry, to make that case that food and drink policy is and should be a critical and crucial determinant of the way people vote and the way the case is presented over the next 18 months. Now, that will take some bravery, because already the level of, I wouldn't exactly call it intimidation, not exactly, but the level of, how should we put it, keen and very partisan interest in the views of representative organisations and of individual corporates is very high. It's mostly, though not exclusively, from one side. There is an assumption on the part of, and I say this with some degree of amusement, there is a kind of assumption on the part of the Remain campaign that corporate Britain is broadly in favour of remaining. And there is a frustration, I suspect, amongst the Remain campaign that corporate Britain isn't quite as prepared as it might be to open its mouth on this particular subject. Well, I refer all of those people to Scotland last year, because the level of rudeness, to put it at no too high a point, the level of rudeness for those who declared a position, whether it actually was for the union or against the union, was really, really quite seriously difficult for individual corporate entities to negotiate and navigate. And you might say that we should man or woman up, and we should get out there and express our position. But actually, for corporates, there is the overriding consideration has to be their really two things: their fiduciary duty, which is their duty to shareholders to create best value, and then their duty of care to their people. And I could tell you some hair-raising stories about some of the things that were done to some of our employees at Diageo in my previous company by those who had different views to the ones that Diageo might have been expected to express, and what kinds of levels of, let's say, retaliation were taken against them. People were removed from school governor roles, which were their personal responsibility, not anything to do with their corporate role. People were told they would not be directors of health trusts. They were told all sorts of things that were consequences of Diageo, would be consequences of Diageo taking a position one way or the other. And you can imagine that there might be a similar climate of concern in this country, and it's wholly, wholly reprehensible. It is actually anti-democratic. And you might think that's a rather strange view from the representative of corporate food, but it is something I feel very passionately about. I left the Labour Party, the personal bit is that I left the Labour Party in 1981, specifically because I was in favour of EU membership, and I didn't think it was. And it's a view personally that I have cleaved to. So for anyone in the Leave campaign who might be here or who might read reports of this, should be no surprise that Ian Wright is personally a supporter of continuing in the EU. I am not, however, in a position to express a view on behalf of the FDF because we haven't taken one yet. We are going through a consultation process with our members. We are asking them two real question areas. One is, what sort of information do you think you need to make a judgment in your company or in your organisation, or to help your labour force make its judgment? That's the first relatively non-controversial area. The second area we're asking about is, do you think that the Food and Drink Federation or the food and drink industry should take a view? And I suspect that that will be more controversial because there are two different questions there, aren't there? One is, should it take a view, and should it be the one that I agree with filling in this form? And I suspect that we will get quite a lot of different answers to those questions rather in the way that we just did. But I cleave to the view that it is vital for the food and drink industry to take its place in this debate because the issues at stake, as Tim said, and as Alan and Peter have implied, are far, far, far too serious for us to leave this to somebody else. The future of the food and drink industry, in my view, and the farming industry, is at stake. I have been intimately and probably very boringly, and perhaps probably completely, you've lot have disagreed with me on the position on obesity in the last, that the Food and Drink Federation has taken over the last few months. Let me tell you one thing. It will not be possible to come to a high-quality resolution of the obesity issue in this country. Or rather, let me put it a different way so my answer isn't constructed as a clear indication of what we should say. The result of the EU referendum will have a profound impact on this country's ability to successfully tackle its obesity crisis. And I think it's really, really important, although we may all disagree on what that result should be, it's important that we come together around that particular issue. Now, very, very quickly, let me just give you a view on some of the issues that I thought Alan laid out, and I'm not going to repeat all of that because you're far more eminent than I am, and anyway, why would you repeat it when it's been put so beautifully? But I think the key impact for my members will be the following. One, the impact on trade. We are an industry that exports and imports. If access to imports and the ability and access to markets outside the UK is affected, that will have a material and detrimental impact on our business. And we heard from Alan very clearly what the real implications are in terms of chaos in a Brexit situation for years about how we negotiate, first of all, our membership of the WTO, not a given, I think, and secondly, how we negotiate the replacement trade agreements and others, treaties and others, for the agreements that currently hold in place because of our membership of the EU. My boss, when I was at Diageo, Paul Walsh, was one of the 5 business leaders that the Prime Minister asked to look at the key issues that surrounded European membership. It was chaired by the guy who was then chairman of B&Q, and I've shamefully forgotten his name, but that group reported to the Prime Minister about 18 months, 2 years ago. I Sherpa'd the group as Corporate Affairs Director of Diageo for a short time. The one thing I can remember from that information finding exercise was that there are 187 different agreements Not all of them trade, some of them about criminal activity, or running the gamut of agreements that the UK would have to renegotiate in order to replace the agreements it currently has through the EU. 187. Now, it's probably changed since then because some will have come, some will have fallen away. But it's not, so it's mostly for business about trade, but it's also about labour markets, and we heard that from Peter. It's about access to labour markets. If I could tell you how much time I've wasted on lobbying government ministers in order to get visas for and get access for high-quality staff into the UK, that's for people outside the EU. If we cut ourselves off from the massive talent pool that is in the EU, we will be in a very serious situation. This industry has a skills gap of 100,000 workers between now and 2025. We are currently 100,000 short because of the age profile of people in our industry. A whole lot of that is going to have to be filled from the EU. If we don't have access to that talent pool, who knows what will happen. We talked about tariff barriers. I think also we should think seriously about the implications for food, if not food security, for food safety, for labelling, for provenance. The EU is a key and welcome legislator and regulator in this field. It helps companies like mine actually, you might be surprised to know, actually are pleased that the EU is the legislator because it allows us to take out cost in the massive repeat costs of creating umpteen SKUs when we're exporting to Europe. I agree entirely with what was said about budgets and the real concern about what happens in a post-Brexit world, about where the money goes. And I think I'm more worried about the polity. I think it's impossible to imagine that the UK doesn't break up in a post-Brexit world. We already know, assuming that the Scottish nationalists remain relatively powerful, they have indicated they would prefer to stay with the EU rather than the UK, and I think that's pretty much the settled will of the Scottish people, even those who voted for the Union. It's difficult to imagine Northern Ireland remaining with the UK despite the Unionist pressure, because most Irish trade is now north-south, not east-west, and there are also all sorts of social implications for them. So we see the breakup of the UK, and that and all the rest of this has one final implication, and that is that many companies headquartered here are here because the UK is a great place to do business in the EU. If you think of the number of companies on my executive committee, 20, half of them, more than half of them actually, about 15 or 16 of the biggest food companies in Britain are either American or European, but they're here because this is the best place to do, they're headquartered here because this is the place to do business in the EU. The clue is in the EU phrase. If we're not in the EU, all the American companies will reconsider. They may not move, but they will reconsider. And many of the European companies will downgrade their operations here and upgrade them elsewhere. Why would they not? So there are all sorts of serious implications here for our industry. I will close with one other observation. There has been an occasion, if only not in history, but in sort of pretend political history, when the issue of food policy became so crucial that it changed the history and made a single person prime minister. Some of you in the audience will be far too young to remember this, but anybody over about 45 will remember the issue of the Great British Sausage and the way in which it meant that Jim Hacker became prime minister of this country. It was the issue of the EU and the Great British Sausage which propelled Jim Hacker from ministerial obscurity into being the prime minister in Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. When you watch the current debates in Parliament and on EU food policy, you have to wonder whether that wasn't a more serious take on the future of food policy than the one that we currently see manifest before us. I've done all that, and I haven't, I think, expressed a much more than a personal view on where we should be on the EU, but I really hope you're in no doubt about what I think.